Hello, students. Welcome back to our critical thought classes. And today we are going to discuss the last critical thought that is there in your second paper. Of course, after that, we are left with two more essays, but they don't directly deal with the critical thought, but mostly generic essays. Anyway, today we are going to discuss about Orientalism. And Orientalism is a part of the post colonial thought or the post colonial criticism that emerged around the 80s, 1980s, and particularly this concept of Orientalism is coined by Edward Said, a renowned post colonial scholar who particularly wanted to situate the post colonial discourse on the binary of East and West, or that was classically known as the Oriental and Occidental. And this concept of Orientalism, which emerged in 1978, he wrote in his book Orientalism. And besides that, also, he had written in his essay Culture and Imperialism the pre colonial and the post colonial experiences of the academic world. And Orientalism was originally a concept dealing with historical and political approach of the Western intellectuals in 18th century. Through 19th century, this concept evolved around the mixed response of colonial masters to the emerging needs of the colonies in the East. And in the first part of 20th century, the political discourse reaffirmed the East-West divide as well as reinforced with several contemporary interpretations in defining the dynamism within their relationship. So, Edward Said, in his seminal book Orientalism, makes an attempt to deal with this concept of Orientalism that was emerging in his contemporary world. And according to him, it is a historical product, and thus it is subjected to the nuances of it is basically fraught with domineering, antagonistic, belligerent, and intellectual experiences. And he explains that the binary concept of Orient and Occident are mutual in their defining the self. The Orient has defined the Occident, and the Occident has defined the Orient. And he explains that the concept Orient is actually a discovery of the colonial scholar to define the Occident, because Occident was not having its existence. So, to create the existence of Occident, they have brought in the idea of Orient. So through Orient, they have tried to discover an Occident. And Occident is often viewed as a material civilization and culture from this point of view, whereas Orient is viewed as a pre civilized humanity with its set of blind beliefs, material underdevelopment, ignorance, etc. etc. So, Said is telling in the beginning of the essay that my argument is that history is made by men and women, just as it can also be unmade and rewritten, always with various silences, elisions, always with shapes imposed and disfigurement tolerated, so that our East, our Orient becomes ours to possess and direct. So, there are two aspects about his statement. One is history is made by men and women. So, history is a mental construct. It is a construct. It is created by certain men and women or belonging to a certain period, which can be unmade and rewritten. And there are many silences and illusions within history, which can be redefined, which can be re explained, or it can be disfigured, or the disfigurements tolerated. And the second aspect of his statement is that Orient becomes ours to possess and direct. So, Orient is a concept to be possessed. So, the emergence of this concept Orient in the mind of the colonial masters is a concept to be possessed for their own existence, for their own glorification. Then he is explaining that my idea in Orientalism is to use humanistic critique to open up the fields of struggle, to introduce a long sequence of thought and analysis, to replace the short bursts of polemical, thought stopping fury that so goal is a belligerent collective identity rather than understanding and intellectual exchange. So he is presenting what is his concept of Orientalism. He is trying to present his concept of Orientalism as a humanistic critique to open up fields of struggle. That struggle on the part of the colonial people, the colonial culture, the colonial civilization, which had been liberalized after hundreds of years of colonization, and also to replace the polemical and thought stopping fury imposed by the West or the European scholarship on the identity of Orient. That how the Orient, as you must be knowing, when Modi visited America for the first time, what he said there in his speech, he said that the concept of the American people about India is probably or had been as the Indian people are the snake charmers. It is a land of snake charmers. But now Indian people are toying with the mouse, means mouse of the computer. So this is also a speech of post-colonial aspect, where he is trying to reverse the image of India in the mind of the Americans. So through Orientalism, Said is also trying to do the same thing. He is trying to reverse the idea of European mind, European scholarship about the Orient. So, Orientalism also dealing with the antagonistic debate or belligerent collective identity, which is trying to understand the intellectual exchange or discourse between the East and West. So he is telling that Orientalism is a way of coming to terms with Orient that is based in European Western experience. Page 241, second paragraph beginning. So he is telling what is Orientalism? It is a definition, it can be asked for 1 mark question. A way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, but also the place of Europe's greatest and richest old colonies, the source of its civilizations and language. So, Orient has provided everything to the Europe, to the Occident. It provided the richness, material richness, as well as civilizational richness. And at the same time, there is the deepest and most recurring image of the other, O capital. Orient is also the other. As we had discussed several times about the colonial mechanism of using the social Darwinism or the missionary tool of using the white man's suffering, where the othering is a tool through which they have tried to enhance their own image as the benefactor, as the civilized, as the big brother, etc. So, Orient has helped to define Europe as its contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. So, he is telling that Orient has helped in defining Europe in its image. What is Europe? It is only defined through Orient. If Europe is developed, Orient is underdeveloped. If Europe is civilized, Orient is uncivilized or pre civilized. If Europe is technically superior, Orient is technically ignorant. So, the Orient is an integral part of European material civilization and culture. So, Orient is not something outside the existence of Occident or Europe. Rather, it is an integral part of European material civilization and culture. And it expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse. So, this is very important. Orientalism expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse with supporting institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, etc. etc. And in contrast, the American understanding of the Orient will seem considerably less dense. He is presenting a contrasting study of European concept of Orientalism and American concept of Orientalism, and he is telling that American concept of Orientalism is considerably less dense because they have not dealt with Orient as a colonial master or for long years. So, Said is bringing out the idea of Orientalism in 3 layers or in three, he is attaching 3 meanings to the Oriental identity. So, he is telling that first of all, It is the academic identity where the style of thought is based on an ontological and epistemological distinction. So, the first layer of meaning or Oriental identity is the academic identity. It is an academic identity where the style of thought is based on ontological and epistemological distinction that is made between the Occident and the Orient. And the second layer of meaning, or the second meaning of Orientalism that deals with, is in the binary concept of East and West. It is the binary concept of East and West, or Occident and Orient. They exist in the opposition to each other. So it is just the binary identity. First one is the academic identity, number one. Number two is the binary identity. And the third identity, or the third dimension, the identity that deals with more historically and materially defined, or it is a concept of the commercial and industrial identity, or the institutions of governance. That means the third concept, or the third meaning atom, is dealing with commerce and industry. That why Orient? Because Orient is important commercial destination or partner of the Occident. And it is the supplier of the raw materials, both agricultural and mineral, to the emerging industries of Europe, and also the institutions of governance that evolved in these colonies. So that is the third layer of identity, or that is the third identity associated with the concept Orient. So it can be asked for 2 marks. What are the different meanings Said is trying to locate within the concept of Orientalism? So Said is trying to locate three identities within the concept of Orientalism. The first one is academic, the second one is uh, the binary, and the third one is the colonial, because it is taking into the group commerce, industry, and institutions of governance. So, in short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So, in this way, may it be academic, may it be binary, may it be colonial. So, what is Orientalism? Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So, under this, we can say it is suitable for study in the academy, for display in the museum, for reconstruction in the colonial office, for theoretical illustration in anthropological, biological, linguistic, racial, and historical thesis about mankind and the universe, for instances of economic and sociological theories of development, revolution, cultural personality, national, religious character, etc. etc. So, Said is telling that the final direction of Oriental identity is sustained through the umbrella of Western hegemony over a complex Orient. It is an umbrella taking into account so many things under it, and a complex Orient. And here He is trying to find out the multiplicity of both Orient and Occident, which are highlighted and engaged at different levels. And finally, Said is coming to the Western consciousness, which out of unchallenged centrality an Oriental world emerged. First, according to general ideas about who or what was an Oriental, then according to a detailed logic governed not simply by empirical reality, but by a battery of desires, repressions, investment, and projections. So, to him, Orientalism to the the Western consciousness is was basically the detailed logic of desires of whom? The desires of the colonial masters, and their repressions. They are repressing something and representing something else on the surface. And investments, they were investing heavily in the concept of Orientalism. Why? Through that, to highlight the Occident. And projection. So Orientalism was a projection. So Orientalism's point of view, question can be asked for 2 marks. So you stick to the last line, that Orientalism to the Western consciousness was governed by battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections. So he is telling that the growing subversion, erstwhile imperial power, as well as within the multicultural, multilinguistic, and multi-ethnic existence of the former colonies themselves, is constituting the Orientalism. So, Orientalism is a subversive thing in 20th century. What it is not what it was in 18th and 19th century. So 20th century Orientalism is a subversive idea. It is a post-colonial study that subscribes to the deconstruction more within the cultural context than the grand narrative that imitates the real world. So Said is presenting his Orientalism as a highly complex idea extending from late 18th century to the 20th century with its diverse uses and objectives. And he is telling that in the post colonial world, the Orientalism is a very powerful subversive tool. And taking his ideas, the other writings, other powerful writings that came in this second part of 20th century, I will suggest in future in your higher studies also you can read one of the famous books, Empire Writes Back. It was published in 1989, written by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith, and Helen Tiffin. And it is presenting a radical critique of Eurocentric notions of language and literature. The title was taken from Salman Rushdie's article, The Empire Writes Back with a Vengeance. So, in this manner, Orientalism is trying to reclaim and rethink history and agency of people subordinated under various forms of imperialism. And I hope you will be very clear about this essay. There are many other post colonial ideas, post colonial writings which you may come across. in future. But for the moment, this is sufficient, and I think I have tried to explain it as far as possible. Okay, thank you.